Welcome in. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today is the fifth and final session of our Living Safely with Lead webinar series. And today's focus is going to be on tenants' rights in Philadelphia's lead abatement law. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get the introduction presentation started. And then, yeah, we can go ahead and get started. Okay, great. So, like always, again, I'll introduce myself in case anyone doesn't know me. My name's Mercedes. I am the environmental health organizer at Clean Water Action. I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction about Clean Water Action and our lead hazard awareness program before passing it to Lydia, who's going to be doing today's presentation. And then we'll have some time for questions and next steps after. First, a quick overview of Clean Water Action. And again, thank you to anyone who's been here a few times and this is repeat information for. I always want to give it just in case there are new folks joining each session, which so far there has been. Clean Water Action, we are an environmental advocacy nonprofit organization. We were initially founded with the passing of the 1972 Clean Water Act, and we've done local, state, and federal advocacy since then. One thing we like to say is water is our middle name, but it's not all we do. In Philly, for example, we also have focuses on environmental justice, PFAS, air pollution, and pretty much all things trash related to zero waste and illegal dumping. And we target these areas in a few ways. First, through legislation. The ones I've listed here are our statewide priorities. So, for example, we have a bill that's working to get lead-free water in all Pennsylvania schools, doing this by replacing potentially lead-containing drinking fountains that are old with newer lead filtering hydration stations. Next is our environmental justice bill that focuses on bringing more protections for communities facing cumulative environmental impacts. And then the next one would be banning PFAS in firefighting foam to protect firefighters. All of these you can read more about or take an online action in the link that Emily is going to put in the chat. With these, if you haven't taken an online action before, they take about 1 minute, and with them, you're able to send an email to both of your legislators to advocate for these bills. So definitely take a look. The next way we focus on our priorities like air pollution, environmental justice, zero waste is through our community programs. First being our Resilient Community Stormwater Initiative. This program targets flooding and stormwater issues by turning old vacant lots into green spaces. Next, our Rethink Disposal program is where we work with restaurants to reduce single-use plastics. And then our lead hazard awareness program is the program bringing you the webinar today. It's a community outreach campaign with the mission of empowering residents to both identify and live safely with the existence of lead hazards in their homes and communities. In addition to the webinar series that we've been doing, we also have 20-minute Living Safely with Lead presentations. So if you're a part of a community group or neighborhood advisory committee that meets monthly or quarterly, we have a 20-minute version of the webinars that kind of takes bits and pieces from each one that we'd love to come and present either in person or virtually. If you are a part of, if you're doing like a community event or resource fair anytime soon, we'd also love to come table. We have a lot of printed materials that we can hand out and give more information to residents or folks in your community if you have any of those events coming up. And then lastly, we're partnering with UPenn to help further fill in their lead and soil map. If you attended our third webinar series, you would have learned a little bit more about that. And I'll also be sending out I recently sent out the recording for that session. So if you want to learn more about that, watch the third session that we held. And then also Emily's going to be putting the link to that in the chat. And so yeah, without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Lydia Ellsworth. She's currently a supervising attorney in the housing unit of Community Legal Services, and her work focuses on eviction defense, habitability, and enforcement of the Philadelphia Lead Paint Disclosure and Certification Ordinance. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to her to tell you all more about that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session today. I am going to get started and share my screen. Just a moment. There we go. And view from beginning. Okay. So as Mercedes said, my name is Lydia Ellsworth. I'm an attorney at Community Legal Services, and I'm an attorney in the housing unit. So a lot of what we do is we represent tenants most of the time in kind of the landlord-tenant eviction context. But a lot of what we do is also, trying to ensure that tenants have safe and habitable homes and, aren't living in substandard housing. So part of having a safe home is, having confirmation that there isn't lead paint throughout the property that could cause you or someone you live with to have health problems. So today I'm going to be talking about the Philadelphia's lead paint disclosure and certification law. So first, we've talked about a little bit about this in other presentations, but lead affects humans. Lead poisoning specifically is very dangerous to humans. Um, it could build up in your body over time as a result of exposure. It's particularly dangerous to children because children, in lead paint specifically, is dangerous to children because children have, mouthing behaviors. They're crawling on floors, which could contain lead paint dust. And it's most dangerous to them if they're exposed to lead while their brains are developing. And the damage that lead poisoning can cause is irreversible. So if a young child is exposed to lead and they are lead poisoned, and that affects their cognitive development, their like behavioral problems, there's unfortunately no way to reverse that. However, there is ways that we could prevent children from being exposed to lead and prevent lead poisoning. So, um, lead poisoning among children specifically is a public health crisis for the reasons that we just talked about. And it does predominantly affect low-income and Black communities. So it's also a racial justice issue in addition to a public health crisis, which is another reason why Community Legal Services puts a lot of effort into enforcing the lead paint disclosure and certification ordinance. And this is just a little bit of background about lead paint and the law. So going back to prior to the 70s, it was normal for builders of homes to use lead-based paint. And in 1971 is when it was first banned in the public housing context, and 1978 was when it was finally banned, across the board. So that's why 1978 comes up as a relevant year a lot, because that's if your house was built before 1978, it's presumed that it has lead paint in it. And then so lead paint was banned, and then, Congress enacted a couple other laws after that to mostly to try to limit the continued exposure to paint, because even though it was banned after 1978, again, lots of properties were built before then. The law that I'm going to be talking about a lot today was passed in 2012. Existed before then, but in the substance that we're going to be talking today, those requirements were first put into law in 2012. At that point, it applied to only houses that had children 6 or under in. And then in 2019, the law was changed to apply to all properties that were built before 1978, regardless of whether they have children in them. And that change was made because the law applying it only to certain houses, it was causing, landlords to discriminate against families and say, I can't rent to you if you have kids. And it wasn't really as effective as it could be. So now it applies to all houses regardless, because, even if you don't have a kid living there, you could have a family member come over, you could be babysitting kids, stuff like that. And then in 2020 and again in 2025, the EPA has reduced the acceptable levels of lead dust to be found in residential homes. So as the science is progressing. The levels allowed, the acceptable levels of lead are decreasing. So we're finding that it's the requirements are getting stricter for what the acceptable levels are, which is a good thing because it's more protective. It's more protective to children and folks living in the home. Okay, so the Philadelphia's Lead Paint Disclosure and Certification Ordinance, like I just said, went into effect in 2012 and has since been amended to become stronger. And the purpose is to prevent lead poisoning resulting from the ingestion of lead-based paint. And again, the main requirements are that the landlord needs to have their property tested for lead, and then it needs to be provided to the tenant. And we are going to get into that. So there are two parts of the ordinance, like the name says. The first is certification. And to comply with that part of the ordinance, you have two options. One option is you could get a lead safe certificate. And that means that you hire a professional, someone who's certified to test for like lead dust, to do lead dust sampling, or who is otherwise qualified to do a comprehensive lead inspection. And you hire them and they come in and they take dust wipes from all of the surfaces in the house. So it's basically they need to test the windowsill and the floor of every room in the house. And they take swabs of testing the lead dust and they send it to a laboratory result or a laboratory. And then they need to get results back confirming that there are not hazardous levels of lead dust in the home. So the current acceptable levels per the EPA are that for floors, the levels need to be under 10 micrograms per square foot. And for windowsills, it needs to be under 100 micrograms per square foot. And the lower threshold for the floors being because, like I said, children crawl around and you generally have more access to the floor than the windowsills. And these kinds of certificates are valid for 4 years. And that's because lead paint degrades, or any kind of paint degrades over time. And as paint degrades and chips, there could be new lead exposed. So they do need to get it retested every 4 years to confirm that the property continues to be lead safe. And this is what a lead safe certificate looks like. It needs to have your unit on it. It needs to have the inspector's license number on there, and it needs to be signed by the lead inspector who said, I confirm that I tested this property and this property is lead safe. The landlord is required to provide it to the tenant at the beginning of the lease. And there's an acknowledgement line so that the tenant says, I'm signing this. I confirm that I received it on, whatever date. The second option that a landlord can take to comply with this law is that they could get a lead-free certificate. And so that is a different kind of testing. It is testing via XRF technology. That stands for X-ray fluorescence, and it's done by with like a handheld kind of like gun, like is shown here. And the inspector confirms that there's no traceable amounts of lead. This kind of certificate is valid indefinitely, so it doesn't expire because the idea is there's no lead at all in the paint, or there's no significant levels of lead in the paint. So even if the paint degrades, it's not going to create a hazard moving forward. Again, the certificate must be signed by the inspector and presented to the tenant before moving in. And this is what this one looks like. It looks pretty much the same. It just states that the property is lead free rather than lead safe. It still needs to have someone who's qualified to do a lead inspection, sign, and put their license number on it. So that's the certification part. So the certification, basically, the landlord needs to take either of those steps, get the property tested for lead and confirm that it is in fact lead safe or lead free. The other element to the law is the disclosure piece. So what the law says is that certification is required, but also the disclosure of information regarding lead-based paint is also essential. Because the idea is that tenants need to know what the status of lead in their home is, so they could be aware of the risks of lead poisoning. And, for example, even if a property is lead free, it's important that the tenant knows that, because let's say they have a child in the home who does, have elevated lead blood levels, then they need to know that where that's potentially coming from. So if they know that the property is lead safe, they can say, okay, it's not like the lead exposure is not coming from the paint. We could get our soil tested and figure it out. We could get our pipes tested and figure it out. So some disclosures that landlords are required to make before signing a lease with a tenant are whether the property was built before or after 1978, since that will, signify whether there could be lead in the paint. They need to give you a valid lead safe or lead free certificate, like we just talked about. If it's a lead safe certificate, then they're required to give you like the lab reports confirming that that there are acceptable levels. I have an asterisk by that point because some judges don't believe that that's required based on the language of the ordinance. However, that is our position, is that they're required to give you those documents, especially if you ask for them, so you can confirm that the levels are okay. There's part of the ordinance, it's like a catch-all part at the end that says whatever language of the ordinance needs to be interpreted in a way that will further the purpose of disclosure. And so our position is that receiving a copy of the lab reports so you can personally confirm, with an attorney or with a doctor that the levels are in fact okay. It furthers disclosure and it makes the tenant more informed about the status of lead. And then they also need to include a lead warning statement in the lease describing the dangers of lead poisoning and recommending a comprehensive lead inspection before signing the lease. And that's what it would look like there. And those are the sections of the law where you could find this information. And then, so that's everything that a landlord has to do before renting out a unit to anybody. The next question is, what happens if a landlord doesn't do any of these things or doesn't do some of these things? So a landlord is going to be non-compliant with the ordinance if they don't give you required disclosures in the lease or when you sign the lease, if they don't have the property tested for lead, or if they only have an expired lead certificate. So if they give you a lead safe certificate that, is dated 5 years ago, they're not going to be compliant with the ordinance. And the city does have kind of like a public database thing where you can see if the landlord has submitted a lead certificate to the Department of Public Health. I am going to send the link in the chat after I'm done, so you could have access to that link easily. Okay. So some remedies, if a tenant finds themselves in a situation where they're signing a lease and they haven't been given a lead certificate, they haven't been given any information about lead paint in the home, there are some remedies that they could take right at the outset. One is you could pay for your own lead inspection within 10 days of signing the lease, and then terminate your lease if any lead-based paint or lead plumbing component is found. You could also, say to your landlord, hey, you need to provide me with a lead safe or lead free certificate. Do you have one? Please send it to me so I could see it. Or if they don't have one, say like you need to do it, you need to get it tested. And then if that fails and they say, no, I don't, or they just don't do it, you can bring an action against your landlord to compel them to conduct a lead inspection. And those are the sections of the ordinance that provide those remedies. Another situation that often comes up is that folks don't know about these requirements before they sign a lease. So they've been living somewhere, a year or several years, and then they discover that the landlord is non-compliant with these obligations. So if you've been living there and you've been paying rent and you discover that your landlord doesn't have the property tested for lead, you can withhold your rent and say, you're not entitled to collect rent. Um, Sorry, that's something I'll get to later. But yes, spoiler alert, the landlords aren't allowed to collect rent if they don't have these things. So you can withhold rent and say, I'm not going to, I'm withholding my rent because I have not been provided with a valid lead safe certificate. So I'm going to withhold rent until you provide me with one. Or you could do what's usually called like a repair and deduct. In this case, it would be getting the property tested for lead and deducting the cost of that from your rent. You could also bring an action against your landlord for all of the rent that you've paid while they haven't had the lead certificate. Up to $2,000 in exemplary damages on top of that, attorney's fees and costs. You could also, ask for an order requiring them to ensure that the property is lead safe and sue for any damages caused by failing to provide a lead certificate, like if you paid out of pocket to get the property tested or something like that. Now, all of those things that I just talked about do sometimes have consequences, including the risk that the landlord will retaliate against you for withholding rent or demanding the lead inspection or something like that. So what would be really important, if a tenant was in that situation, is first to like document everything, right? So any conversation that a tenant has with their landlord should really be overwriting. Particularly regarding if it's like asking for a lead certificate, something like that. It's also important that the landlord is notified of why you're doing whatever you're doing, right? If you're withholding rent, they need to be notified that you're withholding rent because you haven't been given a lead certificate, or that if you're deducting rent, you're doing that because you had to pay out of pocket to get the property tested for lead. And then if your landlord, still retaliates against you and sends you a notice to vacate, saying you have to move, in retaliation for withholding rent or requesting documentation regarding lead, then tenants have the right to file a complaint with the Fair Housing Commission. That's why it's important that you need all this in documentation, because you want to be able to prove that you're being retaliated against for exercising your rights under the lead ordinance. There are also, tenants oftentimes find themselves in court. So there are protections to tenants in court if the landlord is not compliant with the ordinance. So the landlords can't collect rent for any period of time that they were in non-compliance. So if you haven't paid rent from January to June, and they got the first time they ever got a lead certificate was in May, then they could only collect rent for May and June. A landlord also can't obtain possession of the unit, so they can't win the eviction action unless they have a valid and active lead certificate that has been provided to the tenant. Ideally the lead certificate should be signed. But really they just most of the time need to prove that they have it and it's been provided to the tenant. Additionally, the tenant can file a counterclaim for any rent paid while the landlord was in non-compliance. So let's say that the amount at issue, it's just a non-payment through like April through June, like we talked about before, but before that, the tenant had paid rent from, the prior year, and during that prior year, the landlord did not have a lead certificate. Then they could file like a counterclaim or a separate small claims action, claiming all the money that they paid while the landlord was not compliant, and that could, basically like offset the amount of rent that they owe. However, it's very important for tenants to seek representation in court so they can most effectively assert these defenses, because there's always, certain issues that come up in these kinds of cases, and you want to have, be able to have an attorney look into them for you and fully assess your claims and give you an idea of how successful it might be. And there's also a program in Philadelphia called the Lead and Healthy Homes Program. This provides resources for families who have children that do have elevated blood lead levels. So the local hospitals have like a data sharing system with the Department of Public Health. So they will notify the Department of Public Health if a child's blood lead levels are elevated. And that happens, the Healthy Lead and Healthy Homes program reaches out, they'll come and inspect the property for lead free of charge, and they'll notify the landlord of noncompliance if it's determined based on their inspection that the lead levels are too high. And yeah, and they'll require them to do abatement basically of the property, which they require them to have like a licensed person do it. So, and if they don't do it, they could ultimately take the landlord to like there's a lead court. So, and if that situation happens, if the Department of Health finds that the property is not lead safe, the landlord is prohibited from evicting or attempting to evict the tenant, changing or attempting to change the lease terms, re-renting the unit to another tenant, or collecting rent. And then this is an example of the letter that the Lead and Healthy Homes would send to the landlord. And it describes everything that we just says and does require them to abate the lead in the property. And some emerging developments regarding the law. There's not been too many cases that have litigated the lead ordinance. There have been a few. So one of them is called Hand versus Fuller. And in that case, the Superior Court opined that tenants can't file claims under the lead ordinance after they move out of the property. So our position on this case is that this ruling is dicta, meaning that it's not actually controlling, because it was an issue that wasn't briefed by the parties. It wasn't necessary to reach in order to resolve the case. And actually, in that case, the tenant was still living in the property while she filed her claims. So it's our position that it was not appropriate for the court to reach that question, and therefore it's not controlling. But it is kind of a legal challenge to some claims because some judges do look to this case and find that it is controlling. There's also been a bill amending the ordinance to codify that ruling in Hand versus Fuller. It was introduced in February 2025, but it hasn't been brought to committee yet. So it seems like it's not really moving forward, but it's still, to be determined. And then the most recent Superior Court case that talked about the lead ordinance was called Cooper versus SGYS St. Ives. In that case, the Superior Court held that tenants can't recover refunded rent, so they can't bring an affirmative claim for the payment of rent if the only issue of noncompliance was the landlord not having the lead certificate signed. So in that case, the landlord did everything correctly, except they got the property tested. I think it was determined it was lead free. They sent the lead free certificate to the tenants, but they didn't ask the tenants to sign them. So in that case, the Superior Court said, essentially this was substantial compliance on the part of the landlord. So you don't get to, get refunded rent based on just the failure to sign the lead certificate. I think that ruling is fine, because what we really want here is landlords to comply with the, substantial provisions of the ordinance. So it's most important that the properties are getting tested for lead and that the results are being given to the tenants so they know about the lead in their home. If the signing is more of a technical issue, the real purpose of having it signed is really just so that the landlord has proof that they gave it to the tenant. So if they have other proof that they gave it to the tenant, that's going to be fine, is I think the ruling of, or, the import of that decision. So that's it. I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can put in the chat the link to the database, and if anyone has any questions. Oh, there might be some in the chat already. Let's see. how to get in contact with, oh, sorry, that was not me. Okay, yeah. Any questions?
Well, first, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of really useful information. I'm really glad that folks got to see it. We have a couple questions so far that have been sent by Kevin that they're in the Q&A. The first one is it true that PHA/Section 8 housing is excluded from this ordinance? If so, why?
Great question. It is not true anymore. Under the 2012 version, it was. Um, so there were a couple, the definition of targeted housing excluded any properties that didn't have kids under 7 and, Section 8 or PHA properties. I don't exactly know why that was the law, probably because there were, federal regulations regarding that, and so they determined that it wasn't necessary for that reason. But when the law was amended in 2019, that exclusion was taken out of the law. So now it applies to all properties built before 1978, regardless if they're owned or subsidized through PHA. And that something I didn't mention during the presentation was that it was amended in 2019, but the law rolled out on like a zip code by zip code basis. So it depends on like what zip code at the point. But basically it started changing in October 2020. And then since October 2022, all zip codes are now phased in.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. The next question is, what sort of protection does a lead safe certificate provide to a landlord who has a child tenant develop lead poisoning? A good cleaning will reduce lead dust to below threshold, but that dust could accumulate again in a short period of time. I believe that there is some false but pragmatic assurance of that 4-year reinspection period.
Yes, and in fact, the science actually states that lead deteriorates like in 2 years. So this law is distinct from any cause of action that a tenant might have for them or their children actually developing lead poisoning. So, and the ordinance does say that it's, compliance with this ordinance of like getting it certified does not relieve them of their any other obligations that they have. Um, so just because a tenant or just because a landlord complied with the certification and got a lead safe doesn't mean that they might not be held liable if for a negligence cause of action or a personal injury cause of action if someone in the home actually does develop lead poisoning.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question we have so far, but feel free to put more questions into the chat, is how does community legal services work? Many families dealing with lead poisoning do not have the money to hire an attorney and have trouble finding attorneys who will take the case. There are so many kids with elevated blood lead levels. It's hard to believe CLS has room to take them all on as clients.
Yeah, so and in fact, um CLS does not do like personal injury cases for regarding the lead ordinance. We don't do personal injury cases at all. So there definitely is, I think, a gap in representation that's definitely needed. My understanding is that most personal injury attorneys don't take lead poisoning cases unless the blood lead levels are pretty high. Um, and that's probably I can't tell you exactly why because I'm not a personal injury attorney. Um, but yeah, there's definitely seems like a gap there. We have resources to represent folks who are having problems with their landlords where like lead is at issue. Um, we don't have unlimited capacity to help everybody, obviously. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would personally love if um, more attorneys were able to take these kinds of cases. There might be problems with the overall success possibilities based on the facts and everything. But CLS can definitely help with folks who are not necessarily having blood like lead poisoning issues. But generally, if that is an issue, there's probably other issues going on with the landlord too, right? Um, so if rent is an issue, if, abatement is an issue, we definitely have the capacity to help folks who find themselves in those situations too. So our services are free. We have in-person intake and phone intake. So we're always there for people who have questions about it. What we'll be able to do, I can't necessarily guarantee, but yeah, it's pretty easy to get like an intake with us. So
Okay, sounds good. And then the next question is from Sarah. What are legal options for lead poisoning that wasn't caused by paint, like from water pipes or construction? Are those not covered?
yeah, so it would still be, I think the same cause of action, not under the ordinance. The ordinance just deals with lead paint. So right now there is no, like equivalent things for like rental protections necessarily for soil or like the service lines. But if someone in the home does get lead poisoning, they would still have like, negligence cause of action, whether it would be, each case is different, whether it would be successful or not. The landlord would probably need to be on some kind of notice that there was lead in the home. Um, but yeah, they don't have the same affirmative obligations to get like the plumbing tested and the soil tested as they do for lead paint. And part of the reason for that is that it has been determined in Philadelphia that the main source of lead poisoning for children is lead paint.
Okay, thank you. That's the only other question we had in the chat right now, other than Kevin giving you a big thank you, which is very nice. Does anyone else have any other questions at the moment? Feel free to use the Q&A, the chat. I haven't disabled microphones or anything, so I don't know if the call is not letting y'all unmute, but if you are able to come up and to ask a question, feel free to do that as well. But yeah, we've got a little bit more time, so feel free to ask any other questions that you have.
What's kind of the one takeaway? You had a lot of great information, but I think it can be hard to remember everything all the time. So what do you think is the one thing that people should take away, if nothing else, from this?
Yeah, I think the main piece of information that I think all renters should know is that um, you have the right to have the property inspected for lead to confirm that it's not dangerous. So you should ask review the documents that you got with your lease so that you could see if a lead certificate was provided to you. Um, and if not, like you need to ask your landlord if they have a lead certificate. I think the most important thing if you're a tenant, especially if you have kids, is that you can confirm that the property isn't harming you, right? So you have the right to have the property tested for lead, and you should assert that right because that's going to, ensure the health of you and, kids or anyone else you have around the home.
Okay, sounds great. Thank
The
you.
way the city enforces this regulation is to make sure that the lead safe certification is filed with the city at the time of license. At the time of license renewal or rental license renewal. I'm wondering if you have a sense of how many landlords there are there in Philadelphia who really never get licensed, and so maybe posing this and many other hazards to their renters.
Yeah, that's a big issue because yeah, like you said, the way that it's enforced is primarily through the issuance of a rental license. So, but I mean, there's even problems with that, right? Like the city is not perfect, so some things do fall through the cracks, so it's not 100% guaranteed. But it's really been, it's really made a huge difference. There's always going to be landlords who just are non-compliant with everything and therefore are really putting tenants at risk by renting out housing that hasn't been inspected at all, that, doesn't probably comply with like various code provisions and everything like that. And if you click on, did I actually send that link? I don't, oh yes, I did. If you click on the link, you can get a sense of, how many properties out there don't have lead certificates. I don't know that they have every single property in the city, but like for instance, my house is on there and I don't like rent it out or anything like that. So you can get a sense of how many properties have lead certificates versus how many properties don't. But yeah, the other way that the lead ordinance is enforced is through those private rights of action that are in the remedies section of the law. So that's one way to fill the gap, which is like still not ideal, obviously, because lots of folks don't know that they do have a right and everything. And that's part of the reason why we try to educate everybody on what their rights are as tenants. And so basically, that's why the tenants have a private right of action so that because they're in the best position to figure out whether their landlord has a certificate or not. So if they find out that they don't, then they could bring that private right of action, and that's supposed to provide further incentive for landlords to comply. Because it's not only I can't collect rent if I have this, it's I actually have to pay back potentially all of the rent I was paid, and landlords really don't want to do that. So that's the part of the law designed to fill in that gap.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, I saw you briefly come off mute. Did you have another question?
I was just going to follow up Lydia's comments to Oren by saying that, I think one of the things that as healthcare providers and advocates we can really work together to do is to educate people about this lead safe regulation when they're planning their families, rather than after they've had a child, that child's gone to 1 year of age and had their blood lead level checked, and getting back into that prevention mode. And so I think it's very good.
Absolutely. Great point. I encourage all of my friends who are having kids, like, before they have kids, to have the properties tested for lead. So definitely.
All right, thank you. For those who don't know, we have some of our environmental health interns on the call today. And Emily asked, I am curious what called you to this work. Can you tell us a little bit about your career journey?
Sure. Let's see. I feel in college, I was taking like humanities classes. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I took a class about poverty, or I didn't take a class about poverty law, but my professor was actually a legal aid attorney. And so that's when I became aware of this field. And I thought like, that sounds great. So I've always wanted to help people in some capacity. That's why I went to law school. I always wanted to do, something legal aid adjacent, or like, criminal justice adjacent. And I interned at CLS when I was in law school, and I fell in love with it. I loved being in an environment where everybody is mission oriented and everybody has, like similar thoughts about, ideas of justice and, is public interest oriented, and is really like, have passion. And that's the reason why we do all this, because it's surely not for the money. So I love being in a space where everybody is like that. And CLS has done such amazing work for so long. I felt like really honored to have an opportunity to work there. And after law school, I clerked for a while, but I always knew that I wanted to come back, and so I was able to. And so I'm really grateful to be able to do this work. There's nothing else I would rather do I love being able to provide free legal services. That's like, I think it's the most amazing thing ever. Because I'm not limited by I'm not limited by what my clients are able to pay. I'm able to give the best possible representation to all of them, regardless of that. And I really love doing that. And I love being there for people who are, experiencing probably one of the worst times in their life. So, yes, definitely can't highlight the value of free legal services enough.
Sure. Thank you so much. And then the next question we have is from Kevin. Are you familiar with similar legislation around the state? It seems that Allegheny County is fairly progressive, but we have quite a bit of trouble with landlords in counties around Philadelphia.
Yeah, I don't know of any similar ordinance to Philadelphia's in any of the counties. Um, I don't think there is one. A lot of landlords after this law was enacted chose to sell their properties in Philadelphia because they didn't want to deal with it. So that's definitely an area that I think there's a lot of room for advocacy. I would love, a law at the state level so that it's just applicable to everyone. Yeah, because like lead poisoning is concentrated among, predominantly low income Black areas, which are often in cities, but Philadelphia is not the only city and it's not the only low income areas of the state. So yeah, I would love to see expansion of these kinds of rights and tenant protections across the state.
Right. Makes sense. Let's see. I don't see any other questions at the moment, but always, like we mentioned before, feel free to use the chat, the Q&A feature, or come off me if you have any other questions. I can quickly just share some next steps. Because this is our last webinar session, there aren't as many next steps as usually are, but I will send out again this recording and slides for you all to access after the session is over. And what else was I gonna say? Oh, and I'll also send out all of Clean Water Action's lead resources. We've been updating our resources that were made in 2018 to kind of be like the 2025 version. And we're currently working on developing a few more. And so I'll be sending out the recording slides and then also just some more LEDs resources from Clean Water. But yeah, we can stay on another minute or so to see if anyone else has any other questions. Okay, well, I think that might be it. Feel free to come off me if I'm wrong and there's more questions, but I think that might be it for today. But thank you again to Lydia for giving us this presentation. Thank you all for attending not only this session, but a lot of the previous sessions as well. And yeah, that's all. I'll be following up over email and I hope you all have a good rest of your week. See y'all. Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Mercedes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lydia. Take care. Bye.